Welcome to the panel on reproductive justice. My name is Jessica. I am a board member of the Secular Student Alliance, and I used to work here at the SSA. Now I work for Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio. And we're going to be talking to you all today a little bit about reproductive justice. It's a wildly important social issue in the everyday life of many Americans. Every day, the religious right seeks to actively block access to birth control and abortion, while also seeking to undermine the reproductive rights of every American person. Everyone deserves to have control over their own reproductive lives and make decisions for themselves based on medically accurate education and easy to find contraceptives and medical care. So what we're going to talk a little bit about today is more what are some of the differences between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, because they are a little different, and you might not know that, though you might know that. But it's not all going to be 101 stuff. We're also going to get into how your group can be involved, what some of the issues that are impacting reproductive justice today are, and all of the different intersectionalities that exist. So I'm going to start by answering this question myself, but rather than just introducing our panelists, I'm going to let them give you a little bit about themselves and then talk about why they are passionate about reproductive justice. So I introduced myself. I am passionate about reproductive justice because I think it's really important that not only do the rights to abortion access, to birth control, to sex education, and everything else exist, but that everybody has the opportunity to get them without having to struggle and without having to fight.
So just like my name and answer that question. Okay, so I'm Buxi, and I suppose I'm passionate about reproductive justice because as someone of hopefully childbearing capacity who has some reproductive concerns and issues in my own life, I want to be in control of the decisions that I make with my body and with potentially one day building a family. And I want to make sure that I have not just the right, but access to all of the systems and technologies that exist to help me build the life that's best for me. And I want everyone else to feel so comfortable and confident as I would like to feel. So it's hard not to be invested.
Hi everyone, my name is Anya. I'm representing URGE today, which stands for Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity. Reproductive justice to me is important because I feel like basic reproductive health care is a basic human right that a lot of people in this country don't have access to today. And I feel like obviously education is really important to that, and I feel like it's really necessary for people to be able to make those like the best decisions for their health and for their family and for their lives, and ultimately be able to have availability to those things.
My name is Callie, Wright. I host a podcast called The Gaytheist Manifesto, and reproductive justice is important to me for a couple of reasons. The most important being that the underlying idea that anti-choice is about is that our bodies aren't our own. And as a trans woman, I don't have a uterus, so I'm never going to need reproductive health services. But a lot of the issues that we face in society are because people deny us bodily autonomy as well. So that's the underlying issue being bodily autonomy is the reason that it really, really makes a lot of sense to me.
Hello, my name is Nicole Terry. I'm an organizer with Black Nonbelievers. We're based in Atlanta and wanted to come up and do some work here with the Secular Student Alliance. It's great to meet all of you. Thanks so much for coming out. What is important for me regarding reproductive rights is the unjustified participation that the religious right has in it based on their ideas that are predicated on concepts that are antiquated and are actually proving to be restrictive in our society and causing issues. There is absolutely no reason why the Bible should be used as information for women's rights in their body, and that's an issue for me, and that's why I'm up on this panel and why it's so important. And again, thank you guys for coming out.
Awesome. So just so I can get an idea of whether or not this is even a valuable question to start going over, how many people feel like they have a good understanding of what reproductive justice is when compared to reproductive rights? And how many people are like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Why is there this difference? It's okay to raise your hand. Awesome. So I'm going to talk really briefly. I want our panelists to be driving this, not me as the moderator, but just so you know a little bit about reproductive justice. So everyone, I'm pretty sure, heard about the Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt case that was up before the Supreme Court that was talking about the targeted regulation of abortion providers in Texas, specifically a few different things that they were doing to try and stop people from getting abortions. And that is not a reproductive rights issue. Technically, even with all of those terrible laws, abortion was still legal in this country. But it was a reproductive justice issue because not everybody was able to access those rights. If you were, for instance, a single mother and you couldn't find childcare, or even any sort of mother, whether you're single or not, and couldn't find childcare for your already existing children, when you had to drive 3 hours to get to a clinic in Texas because they closed the one right by you multiple times because of waiting periods, suddenly you don't have the right to access abortion in this country. Yes, it theoretically, technically still exists, but it isn't in practice. And that's what we're talking about trying to change here. So that should hopefully give you a little bit of framework for our discussions. So I would like our panelists to talk a little bit about why they think secular students should be involved with reproductive justice. Feel free to start with whoever feels like they have a good answer for that. Why is this something that secular people should care about? It's not secularism, it's not atheism. Why does it matter?
Well, I think it is secularism because the point is the people who are leading the charge against it are using religious justifications to do so. And obviously, there are people, there's an organization called Catholics for Choice. Not every religious person is anti-choice. But the fact is the people who are leading those fights are successful because they're using religion as a tool and because of the privilege that religion has in society. So I think, when we're talking about any social justice issue, I think that's really the reason that secular people and secular students should be involved.
Absolutely. I'm from Tennessee, and there's always an automatic kind of recoiling response when you ask an individual how they feel about abortion. And that's because there's this misconstrued idea that individuals who are in support of abortion are immoral. And that's because of this concept that God has created people. And having that concept as the basis for your understanding for nature is detrimental because it doesn't provide you with the information necessary to make choices regarding what's actually occurring in nature. Does that make sense? If you have a misunderstanding about what's happening in your environment, you don't necessarily know how to best traverse your environment. You don't necessarily know how to best respond to it. So if you do end up getting pregnant, not necessarily involuntarily, but unintentionally is what I'm saying, and also involuntarily, that can occur as well. If you approach the pregnancy from the standpoint of the child is a result of God's grace or a gift from God, and He's created this child in His image, and therefore this child has, value from that standpoint, that's going to skew the decisions that you make regarding raising the child, regarding your relationship with the kid, and if you're not ready to take, take that step to raise the child, that could also cause you to make a decision that's not best for you at that time. So that is exactly why this is a secular issue, because this is an issue that we all deal with, despite our backgrounds in religion. However, the religious right, they've kind of got a monopoly on this issue. They know how to paint the issue in a light that's so incredibly negative that they're able to gain funding for pushing their agenda. And that's why it's incredibly important that us as secularists are involved in basically not just in educating them regarding the science, but teaching them that the foundation that they're using to make these decisions the foundation is already crumbling. It's not well established. And if we can do that in a way that's kind, showing them that it's not immoral to have secular values, they'll be more willing to listen to us. We're people as well. Hope that makes sense.
And I think you touched on something that's pretty important, is reproductive justice and reproductive rights don't just cover what I think a lot of people who are secular students right now are worried about, which is not having children. Because I feel like most secular students, not all, don't want to have kids right now. But many people do want to in the future, or maybe they don't, and that's totally okay too. But the right and the ability to be able to raise children how you want, or when you want, and that is also a very important thing. I know that you were talking about bodily autonomy. Is that something anybody else has anything that they'd like to add to? Because that is at the core of reproductive justice, is making sure that you are in charge of your own body. And that's really one way that this is an intersectional issue, because it touches on queer issues, it touches on race issues, it touches on everything. I don't know if there's anything anyone else would like to expand on there.
Yeah, I think a really important aspect of the framework of reproductive justice is giving everyone like comprehensive sexual education. Like recently, URGE just worked on a bill called REA, which we lobbied for in DC, and basically it calls for, on a federal level, sex education for all grade levels that's age appropriate and inclusive to LGBT experiences. Being able to educate people, like giving them accurate medical information, which is not like the law in every state, unfortunately. It also gives people education on how to identify sexual assault and sexual harassment, and how to reach out to people and help victims. And I feel like that's really crucial to giving people full agency over their body and knowing like the power that they have over their own bodies. So
I think what you bring up there is super important, because I think the religious right tries to make this a conversation that's strictly about abortion, and abortion is important, but it's not the entirety of it. You talk about comprehensive sex education. It's about comprehensive sex ed. It's about access to contraception, and it's people tend to think of, like, when we use the word family planning, people like to paint that as being a euphemism for abortion, but it's really not. It's about the idea of you don't have an abortion necessarily because you never want kids. Maybe it's not the right time. You know what I mean? It's about people having the ability to actually plan their families in the way that they want at the time that they want. Yeah. It's not just about that, even though that's an important part of it.
Right, and to piggyback on that a little bit, the majority of people who have abortions already have children before they go in for the procedure. And I think it's interesting, and to jump back a little bit to what you had said about why secular people should care about this issue, every year we have an event called the Reason Rally now, and I think it's broadly accepted that we want to advocate for things that are reasonable and things that are based in reason. And just as it's unreasonable to imagine that a God made the world and everything in it in 7 days, and every species of animal that we have came 2 by 2 on and off of an ark, it's unreasonable to imagine that anyone's purpose, if you can forgive me to use this word, is to just be an incubator for every pregnancy that they may happen to have in the course of navigating life as a human being. So it's unreasonable to think that, and that's kind of the perspective that anybody who expresses opposition to sex education, to contraceptive access, to abortion access is working from, is this unreasonable conception of how people should be living their lives and what their bodies are good for.
This is great. So what do you all think are some of the biggest barriers right now to having reproductive justice? Whether they're legal barriers, whether they're barriers that aren't codified in law but just kind of exist, and how are ways that students might be able to get involved on those issues and on tackling those?
The biggest barrier that I see is, I think a lot of times people, when they're talking about reproductive rights and reproductive justice, is that the two sides of the debate talk past each other, I think, because I think obviously the other side of the fence is wrong, but I think we do have to understand what exactly their reasons are before we can convince them otherwise. I think a lot of times we paint anti-choice people as, you're anti-women, you hate women, like that kind of stuff, and like, when you're advocating against women's rights, obviously that's a net negative, that's a bad thing, but I think talking to people that way is not how you're going to convince them to come to our side. So I think being able to have the conversation and being real about it, but I think meeting people and understanding where people are coming from before you just start talking at them, I think would be a great thing that I don't necessarily see enough of.
I agree with that. I think that one common preconceived notion that comes along with religious belief is a natural dispensation of men over women. And when we're talking about this issue, and we tend to discuss the politicians who are interested in pushing these ideas that restrict reproductive rights, restrict the education that's so necessary for basically just informing people as to the ways to make the best choices regarding their bodies, the best choices regarding sexual health, sexual safety. We're talking to individuals who may have not had the need to be in these positions because they've always been in a position of power. And it's also kind of the same thing when we're talking to Christians as well. Christians are the dominant demographic regarding religion the dominant religious demographic in our country. They don't understand at times that this is an issue that a lot of people face who don't have voices. And when the problem arises, you need to be willing to listen. And we need them to understand that, but at the same time, piggybacking off what Callie said, the ability to understand why somebody does things gives you this incredible gift, in that it allows you to pinpoint the argument, or basically direct the argument that you're making to their personal issue. Does that make sense? Basically, if I know why you hate something, I can provide you with exact reasons why you shouldn't hate it. And therefore, when using that logic, or when you're using that way of discussing, and you're not arguing, you're not debating and screaming at each other, you're helping people understand why they believe things, you're helping them to kind of peel back the layers of their own reasoning. This is maybe something they've never thought of before. Why do you feel that there's a natural dispensation of men over women? Well, that's something naturally that we've been taught. It's something that's perpetuated in our media. It's something that's perpetuated in our family interactions. It's something that's perpetuated in our everyday interactions. Maybe when you go somewhere and the man is automatically given the position of leader, or something like that. That seeps into other areas of our lives, and it seeps into this area of reproductive rights as well. And if we can help people realize that these the reason that they hold these beliefs is because they're instilled, and help them understand why they're instilled, where they come from. We can peel back the layers of them, break them down, and then we can start helping them understand why it's necessary to change their view, and how it would benefit them as well, because healthy sex education is good for everyone. It's beneficial for everyone, and they can learn something too. So, yeah.
Yeah, going back to the original question too, I think one of the main barriers behind access to reproductive health care is like rooted deeply in like systemic like white heteropatriarchy, because there's, I don't know if you guys know about the Hyde Amendment, but it's this law that it doesn't allow people to use Medicaid to fund their abortions, which it disproportionately affects people of color, LGBT people, because those are the people that usually need governmental help. And there's actually a bill traveling through Congress right now called the Each Woman Act, which would overturn that. And that would open up a lot more access for people who are already oppressed. So definitely call like your representatives, people who are in Congress. Also contact like your local government officials, like email them or call them and let them know how you feel about these bills, because like giving your opinion really does make a difference.
And I think that there already are some states that use the state money that they have available from Medicaid to pay for abortion access. So there are some states are able to take some action of this. So local level elections are really, really important for this sort of activism. Everyone likes to pretend that the president is the end-all be-all and that that's the most important election, but really these laws go into place because of all of the little teeny tiny things that happen at state governments all around the country. When you look at the trap laws that are going through Texas, there are a bunch of them here in Ohio. It's awful, and they can't be changed right now because the legislatures are so, I think it's something like 30 of the legislators around the country are controlled by people who are anti-choice. So that makes it really difficult to have proactive reproductive health issues.
If I could, I'm not sure where you were going next with questions, but if I could just build on this idea of the importance of being involved in local level, not just national, but state and local level legislature and activism. Here in Columbus, the Planned Parenthood clinic that I work at was a few months ago vandalized by a pretty ideologically negative, very committed anti-choice protester. And as a result, people reached out to our city council and said, hey, this is something that's important to our community and it's under attack. What are you going to do about it? And recently, city council unanimously passed a measure to create harsher penalties for people who engage in harassment and intimidation within 15 feet of our clinics. And there was some pushback, there was some opposition, but really all it took was for somebody to stand up and say, hey, you're responsible for demonstrating leadership and protecting this important asset of our community. What are you going to do to make this a safe place for people to access legally protected services? And here, our legislators responded very positively and said, okay, this is important, we are going to do something about it, and they are doing something about it. So never underestimate the power of local politics and the power of your voice to influence those systems.
And just because, as I'm sure you guys have heard before, the SSA is a nonprofit, which means we can't be partisan. That doesn't mean you can't stand up and do individual issue advocacy with your groups. So a great way to get involved with your group is to do some issue advocacy. The panel before us was talking about coalition building. That's a great resource that you can use, band with the other groups on your campus that care about this, and you can do some issue advocacy. You can do voter registration. You can talk about how important local elections are and try to inspire your campus to show up more than once every 4 years. Let's see, what is next? We've got, so everyone knows about, or assuming a lot of people heard about the recent Supreme Court decision that struck down 2 different trap laws in Texas, which is great. Not necessarily as far-reaching as we would have liked it to be, because it doesn't automatically invalidate all of those laws in other places, but it is a huge, huge start. How important do you think that will be for reproductive justice and for reproductive rights? And how do you think it's going to impact abortion rulings across the country?
I think it's incredibly important. I lived in Texas previously and did crisis intervention through the Houston Area Women's Center there. And there were a lot of issues that arose regarding reproductive rights, and there was just a lot of restrictions regarding what we could do with those issues because we were in Texas. But however, the fact that this has been struck down in Texas shows that there is progress being made, and that as long as people are willing to voice their concerns on the grassroots level, to be directly involved in primary interventions, we can actually make change. And I think for me, that is the most encouraging part about what's taken place, and probably one of the most rigid, inflexible areas in the country. So it just goes to show, and also, excuse me, from your example as well, just how your passion and your just dedication to the cause can make so much difference. So I think that's wonderful, and I want to see those things continue, but it's definitely not going to stop there. We have to continue to maintain that progress, because for every step we make, there are people that are fighting to push us back and take back that step. So it's wonderful that that's happened in Texas, and we definitely have to continue to, promote these things in other areas of the country.
Yeah, I definitely think the recent SCOTUS decision is definitely a step in the right direction, because we're already seeing like a domino effect in some states where they brought their cases to the Supreme Court, but it's been turned down, which has in effect brought an end to a lot of major state abortion restrictions. So we're hoping to see that sort of happen in other states across the country too.
And for anyone curious, those specific laws that were overturned in Texas, which means that once they work their way through the courts in other in other states that will be invalidated, were the surgical center requirement, which has been their big one, pushing for women's health, because you need to have it outfitted like a surgical center, so you can have 2 gurneys going in both directions, and big drainage for something that's not even really that is not really surgery. It's a procedure. And I think in Texas it even went so far as to restrict medication abortions to have to be happening in surgical centers, which is a little bit ridiculous, but that's okay. And the other one that was overturned was the admission privileges requirement for doctors. So the new wave of anti-abortion restrictions is kind of coming up under the guise of women's health. And what this Supreme Court really said was that you have to actually have proof that these laws make it more healthy for women. One of the questions that was asked I think it was by Justice Kennedy during the oral arguments was, well, do you have a single case of a woman who would have been helped by this situation if we have these laws, and now that we do have these laws, they have been healthy and their life has been saved and they've been healthier? And they were like, no. This doesn't really do anything to that, and now we have that burden is now undue if there isn't any benefit to the alternative. So that will hopefully result in other restrictions being overturned, though they have said things like waiting periods are legal, and waiting periods are a huge, huge reproductive justice issue. Sorry about that. Let's talk a little bit more concretely on what secular students can go back to their groups this fall and this spring and do about these issues. What are some of the groups maybe that they should be working with on their campuses or off their campuses? What are some of the things that they can do to go out and make change?
I feel like I have this microphone way too much. But oh, good. Okay. Well, that's reassuring. I know a lot of individuals. I live in Atlanta, and I know we have a very strong LGBT community there. And I know that people have been putting forth a lot of efforts to take the interventions into the streets, talking to people. Grassroots is extremely, extremely important because I feel that when we start talking about issues on the hierarchical level, of just what you were saying regarding the president, it seems incredibly detached. It's almost like I don't have the power to do anything regarding that, so I'm just going to kind of step back into the shadows and hope things go my way. Absolutely not. You are the voice that people need to hear that will reassure them that whatever they're going through, they are not alone, that there are options out there for them, that there are educational initiatives and alternatives. And the way to do that is to get involved with these groups. In Atlanta, we've got Aid Atlanta, which works with the LGBT community. There are also other interventions. Planned Parenthood, I know in Atlanta, does a lot of outreach. There's also women's centers that do outreach as well. I am also a huge advocate of starting your own because nobody can do what you do better than you. And if you are one of those people who have a very strong sense of initiative and discipline and you can take your cause to the streets and take it out and see the benefit of that, do it. That's what you can do. And you're young. You have an amazing ability to kind of affect the world in a way that a lot of people don't have at this point who are a lot older and have been in the movement for a long time. You are well versed in the issues that confront those coming up through the ranks of these social issues that we're talking about, if that makes sense what I'm saying. So I advocate for grassroots involvement. I think that's incredibly important because one of the most amazing things that I have experienced, and especially during things like this or events like this, is talking to people who identify with what I'm going through. That is one of the most reassuring things you can provide somebody. So if you can do that, also, maybe someone's not thought of doing things the way you do it. So take your ideas out there. There are ways to get funding. You can take classes on grant writing, fundraising. There are ways, there are resources, there are small business groups out there that provide free mentoring, free coaching. There's all types of opportunities. So,
sorry for interrupting, but the SSA also has project grants. So if your group has something innovative that you want to be doing around reproductive justice, write to us about it. Go fill out the project grant form, and we have money available to help you do the work you're doing. And I know reproductive justice is one of our big focuses for, I know it was last year, and I think it will continue to be in this upcoming year. So this is something we want to see you organizing around. And it's one of our issues because you've told us you want to be organizing around it too. So.
Yeah. That's perfect. That's another resource that you can use. And just, pick the brains of individuals like Jessica. Seriously, talk to these people. If this is something you're passionate about, take it out to the streets because a lot of people don't know enough about it and a lot of people aren't comfortable enough within it to actually take the steps to make the change that we have to see. But if you're that uncomfortable with the way things are taking place in your society, the society that you're going to have to raise your children in, you're the one that's going to have to make that change. So do what you got to do, and that's the way to, get that money from the Secular Student Alliance.
Yeah, another thing that's really worked for my organization on campus is reaching out to other orgs who are striving for the same thing. Like for the URGE chapter at Ohio State's campus, we did a lot of events with other groups. Like we did a showing of a documentary called After Tiller about late-term abortions. If you haven't watched it, I definitely recommend it. We did that showing like in this room actually with like med students for choice and some other like pro-choice organizations. We also did like a comedy show where we partnered with 2 different comedy groups on campus. So we did like a local comedy night that did like fundraising for Planned Parenthood. And yeah, definitely reach out to other groups because like numbers really make a difference. It lets you gain more visibility to let people know that there are a lot of people who feel really strongly about these issues.
I think another thing, and this is kind of more philosophical than practical, but I think it's also important because a lot of us get into activism because these things affect us personally, right? Like I do trans activism because I'm trans. But I think a lot of times it's also important to get to know why these things are important to other people, so you don't get the idea like once I've accomplished what I want to accomplish for myself, that I forget what affects other people. So so much of the victory that we've seen has been reaffirming reproductive rights, but there's still an access issue. That's the difference between rights and justice, right? So once we've won the victories that are important to us, we need to make sure that we're not forgetting about what affects other people. So people in poverty and that kind of thing, and access issues. Because one of the things that I was really terrified about after the marriage equality decision was that we were going to forget, like, you can get married, but you can still be fired from your job when you get home from your honeymoon, that kind of thing. So I think it's important that none of these victories are whole victories, right? It's piecemeal. It's you win bit by bit by bit, and you just want to make sure that once you get the specific thing you're interested in, that you don't lose interest in this activism, because there's so much left to do that's important to groups of people who may not share characteristics that you have, if that makes sense.
And I think that's really important, just quickly. When it comes to reproductive justice, abortion access, honestly, is something that I'm never going to have to personally worry about. I have a lot of privilege. I am a straight, white, cis woman from a middle-class family with a really supportive middle-class family. I'm really, really lucky that I'm as privileged as I am. But I'm always going to be able to travel, even if I have to travel outside of the United States and go to Canada or Mexico or overseas or whatever I have to do. I'm going to be able to get an abortion. But that doesn't mean that I should sit back and stop worrying about it, because it's just as important, if not more important, that people who aren't in my situation have access to these rights, and making sure that everybody has those opportunities to the best that we can. So I think that's really, really important, is making sure that the fight is about more than just yourself.
And I wanted to give a quick shout out to abortion funds. There are organizations that exist kind of at local, regional levels and at the state levels that help raise money to help pay for people to get these abortions that they're supposedly legally entitled to unless they can't afford them. And that's one thing. If you go back to your organization and your campus and think, well, who can we reach out to do something? Anya had mentioned, building. I think there have been workshops already and panels about coalition building, and it's really important. It's a really good theme about working with other organizations. The Ohio statewide abortion fund, Women Have Options Ohio, has a few people who have been reaching out to them recently to do independent fundraisers. So these people who are not necessarily affiliated with Women Have Options have done their own projects to raise money to then donate to Women Have Options to help out the cause. There's one going on right now where there's a group that's organizing called the Feminist Flag Corps, and they made these awesome flags, the Don't Tread on Me flag with like the snake and whatever. They made one that says "Don't tread on me," but it's like a picture of a uterus, and the fallopian tubes are coming out and they're snakes. I bought one. I was really excited. But they marched in a parade and did like a flag. There's a word for it. I don't know what it is.
Flag Corps.
Flag Corps. Yes, sure. It's like that I just said out of my mouth. I feel like there are other terms, but I don't do anything that involves being coordinated. But they had a great time. But all of the money that this group of just people hanging out who were passionate had went to the abortion fund. So that's something I think you should consider, like being the organization that does the project and having it go toward that kind of initiative that somebody's already set up the infrastructure for.
And I think the national umbrella group for that, forget if it's the National Abortion Fund or the National Abortion Foundation.
I think it's Federation.
So it's the NAF. If you Google them, you'll be able to find them and connect to them. They do a bowl-a-thon every year, so it could be as simple as doing a bowl-a-thon team. Everyone gets to get together and ask their networks to raise money for this really, really important issue. Sometimes things that we might not think about impacting something like reproductive justice have a huge, huge impact on reproductive justice. And one of the things that we wanted to connect with when we were talking about this earlier was talking about the impact that something like police brutality has on reproductive justice. So if anyone wants to touch on that, I think this would be a good time.
Yeah, I think in light of recent events, especially with the shootings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, a lot of Black families are afraid to bring children into this world because of the violence that goes on against people of color. And I feel like giving them the accessibility to make choices about like how they want to raise their family, and like they don't have control over like the social environment that those children will grow up in. I think it's really important to give them those choices to whether or not they want to bring children into their lives. So
empowerment is extremely important, and I have this conversation with my fiance. We've had this exact conversation. Do we want to have children? Do I want to reproduce a person who's going to be born and be hated for the sole purpose that they have darker skin? What am I going to tell them when they come home from school and something's happened to them that has traumatized them, is going to carry, that they're going to carry with them for the rest of their life? Or when they hear about the news, or when they're on social media and they see the recurrent posts from news outlets and other people discussing it. Or maybe when they do try to say something regarding it and they speak up and they're automatically ridiculed. Racism's not a problem. It's a systemic issue. You're not in a field anymore. Aren't you okay with that? What's wrong? Are you not happy? Do you want something more? It's difficult to try to portray these issues to individuals who don't have to deal with them daily. And when you're a parent and you're having to answer these questions for your children and you haven't been able to answer them yourselves during the course of your life, that is scary. And I'm in the position now where I don't have children yet, so I can actively make an informed choice regarding whether or not I want them. And that is a big issue for me. It is a concern. What I say regarding that is, and what my fiance and I have discussed, because we are going to have to make the choice eventually. If I choose to have children, I want to do everything I possibly can to empower them from the inside out, because there's nothing I can do to change my environment, as Anya said. Not the social aspect of it, as far as what goes on outside of my home. But within my home and within the confines of my interaction with my kids, I can make sure they're as empowered and as encouraged and in love with themselves as possible. And I can do the best I can to equip them with the social skills, with the communication abilities, to go throughout the world and be as successful as they can. Because I think what other people do forget is that even within the African American community, there is a strata of privilege. There are different layers of opportunity. And within the, within the control that you have, you should do the best you can to increase the privilege for your kids and increase that opportunity for them. And another thing that you can do if you have this concern as well, because it isn't just African Americans who have these concerns regarding violence, people who live over, well, we are talking about America, but maybe people who live overseas or live in incredibly violent homes or are raised in abusive, abusive homes where they're afraid. Maybe they can't prevent their kids from maybe experiencing emotional turmoil. Just do the best you can. I don't have them. But I know that people have the best, intentions, and they try. And if you can raise well-developed, well-adjusted children, then they can go out in the world and continue on with these purposes and these causes that we've got. They can get out on the grassroots level as well. And they can also go out and relate to other kids and hopefully try to dispel some of these false ideas that people have regarding race. And also help people realize that there are ways to feel safe within their own environment, and maybe help not only the kids but also those who don't have children understand that you can provide an element of safety for your kid, and you should enjoy childbirth if that's something you desire to experience as well.
Thank you. So we've got about 10 or 15 minutes left. I'd like to know if you all have any questions that you'd like us to answer. We have a great group of people here, and I already see a hand. So yeah.
I'm wondering if any of you have worked with either individuals or groups from Ireland about working for reproductive rights and justice. They have a very specific issue with getting those rights and access due to the Catholicism control and the fact that if they want to get an abortion, they actually have to cross Have any of you worked with anyone?
Yeah, and just to repeat, to make sure it gets caught on our recording, she was asking about if anyone here has worked with people in Ireland. If you don't know, in Ireland, abortion is completely illegal. It's actually a constitutional amendment, and I believe that they have a movement going on right now to try and change that. So if you want to be able to get an abortion in Ireland, you have to go to England. You have to travel across an ocean. So has anybody?
I haven't, but I would be happy to say something briefly on it if that's okay. The situation in Ireland is awful. I don't think that I have words to describe how awful in 2016 it is that there are still places where abortion is that seriously banned. But I am aware of, at the very least, an organization that you may have heard of and that I think a lot of people might be familiar with called Women on Waves, or Women on Web. And they work to help make abortion more accessible in areas where it is not, or where it is specifically outlawed. And I've been reading recently about them using drones to drop medications to facilitate abortions in Ireland. And there's been a lot of controversy about whether that's okay and all of those things. But yeah, that's about the only resource that I'm familiar with. I'll assume that everything else going on there is kind of underground. It's not a good situation.
Yeah, Women on Web is a really cool, I think they did change their name to Women on Web instead of Women on Waters. They used to just like operate out of a boat and go and park places and take women and then drive to international, or not drive, but take the boat to international waters and provide the abortion pill to people who needed it. They're a pretty cool organization. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to give you some personal background, I've been talking to my doctor for about 1.5 years about getting a tubal ligation, and just for my personal and health reasons, it is not a good idea for me to bear children. And in the state of Tennessee, the law says that anyone 18 or older, it is okay for them to get this procedure legally. But she denied me getting this procedure until I'm at least 27, because she said she had a moral obligation to, in case I ever backtracked on my decision, but this is a really important issue for me. I was wondering if any of y'all had like any tools that I could put in my arsenal for going, one-on-one, not like as a group activism kind of thing, but just a personal activism to, for my own health and the importance of that.
Yeah, so before anyone gets to answering, she's asking about, she's been personally wanting a tubal ligation and has talked to her physician, and which is really, really common. A lot of physicians refuse tubal ligations to women, even though they are legally allowed to get them, because they think that women might change their mind about having kids. It is really, really difficult in this country to get a tubal ligation if you are under the age of 30. And she was asking for resources or ways that she could personally, or any resources to take to a one-on-one conversation or anything like that. I will say that this is a really common problem. It looks like there's a hand in the back who might have some answers or questions or something to add, but before you get going, I'll just say that this is not something that you are facing alone. It is something that women all across the country have to face and have to deal with, and a lot of times what people have found to be the most successful is to change physicians, which is really unfortunate, but just to keep trying different physicians until you find someone who is willing to do the procedure for younger people. Believe it or not, women are not fickle creatures a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes everyone is a fickle creature, but a lot of people who know that they don't want to have kids really have thought through this decision, and if they change their mind, there are other ways to become a parent other than having a kid out of your vagina. So, yeah, go ahead with your response.
I am literally dealing with the exact same problem. 22, had an ovarian tumor, want it gone. Want the whole kid glue out. Good. But the problem that I specifically faced was that the gynecological oncologist that I've been seeing for a while works at a Catholic hospital, and she particularly wanted me to have tubal ligation, but she's bound, by religious, directives by her hospital, because she can't. And my personal, I was lucky enough to have a doctor who supported, even though she can't particularly do it, and she actually recommended me to the OSU medical facility, because she knows some people there. And if you have a specific
And something that was touched on in that response was talking about Catholic hospitals. And this is actually a huge problem in this country right now. I think it's something like 60% of hospital beds in the United States are controlled by Catholic hospitals, which means they have to answer to a moral board of directors that gets to choose whether or not your procedure is okay to do. There's actually a case where someone is litigating over it, where she has a brain tumor that makes it dangerous for her to give birth and to be operated on, and she just had her second kid and did it by cesarean section because going through labor would have been very, very difficult for her. But there's also the risk of going in under anesthesia, and her doctor was saying, you can't have any more kids. If you have any more kids, there's a good chance that you could die. And if you go under anesthesia again after getting the C-section, there's a good chance you should die. We should really go ahead and do a tubal ligation while we're already in there, which is really common after a C-section to get a tubal ligation. I know not everybody will know that. And the Catholic Hospital's Board of Directors refused. They would not let her, even though it was her doctor's recommendation. She was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, and at that time it's too late to go and try and find another hospital willing to do all of this. So they're literally putting patients at risk. There are all sorts of cases where people have started to miscarry, and it's much more dangerous for them to hang out and wait until they get an infection when you're in the middle of miscarrying. But the Catholic hospitals have said, sorry, we will not complete this termination, even though there's no chance of the pregnancy to actually survive to viability. So Catholic hospitals in the United States have a huge amount of power, and that's something that ties directly into secularism. That might be a really good start for your group to get involved with when it comes to reproductive justice.
Yeah, my wife actually went through the same process. She'd already had a child, decided she was okay with not having more, and had a doctor shop. She did change her mind 10 years later, but there are options even if you want to have a child with your own vagina. Tubal ligations can be reversed. It's not 100%, but it can be done. And also IVF is an option. When she changed her mind, we had a test tube baby. And well, Ireland especially, if you think about some of the previous religious objections to reproductive health in the 70s, the first test tube baby is about my age, and the amount of hell they went through dealing with religious objection to that. And I still get a little bit of sideways looking from my Southern Baptist family because we did that. And I just tell them we have a science baby and it's cool.
I don't know if anyone has anything they wanted to add here right now before we move on, while we're still talking about this question. Yeah.
Were you about to go?
Did you have something?
Yeah, actually there was some legislation or lobbying for legislation on the table with regard to that. I think it was American Atheists. They were trying to push legislation where doctors in Catholic hospitals and religious doctors would be required to display on their wall procedures that they will and won't do. It certainly wouldn't help you with your getting your procedure done that you want, but at least you wouldn't have to suffer the indignation of having to sit through that visit. And I'm sure they billed you for telling you what they would not do as well. So there was legislation submitted for that.
Yeah, and a little bit of bias here, but if you're looking for a friendly doctor, even though you probably couldn't get the procedure done at a Planned Parenthood, they might be a great place to point you to somebody who would be willing to listen to your reproductive autonomy.
On the note about sterilization, it's worth pointing out the facility that I work in performs vasectomies. And when I take a road trip anywhere, I see lighted signs on the side of the road for places where you can get a vasectomy with phone numbers that you can call to go in and just get it done. And though I realize that it's not necessarily something really easy and willy-nilly to do for someone who has a scrotum and a vas deferens to get a vasectomy, there can still be issues and barriers to cross to do that. It seems to me to be a lot easier, a lot more accessible than for someone who has a uterus and fallopian tubes to get a tubal ligation. And when you look a little deeper into that, there is absolutely a religious root to why that is. And it's something we should all be concerned about.
You don't see Hobby Lobby concerned about the fact that their insurance still pays for vasectomy and Viagra when they're so concerned that it's paying for birth control.
And can I jump off of something that she just said and change the subject just a little bit? Because one of the things that she said, you noticed that she didn't say men or women, right? She said people with a uterus, people with a scrotum and vas deferens, right? So I think sometimes what's lost in the conversation is that these issues affect trans people as well. Our society likes to pretend that trans masculine people don't exist. There are trans men who have uteruses who do want to reproduce, and they should have equal access to this care as well. And on the trans feminine side of things, people who are assigned male at birth like me, I'm happily child-free. I don't see myself wanting kids, but there are people who do, and sperm banking is incredibly expensive. And going on HRT removes your body's ability to reproduce. And so that's another access issue for people who do want. There's a myth that trans people hate their bodies, and that's not necessarily true. And that we should be able to reproduce just like anyone else should be able to with all of the options available. And the idea being here when we're talking about access, trans people are one group that's disproportionately affected by poverty. So we largely don't have access to those services either. So I think that's another important thing to put in the conversation, especially talking about trans masculine people who have a uterus and who have functioning reproductive systems and want to keep it that way. That's just as valid as any other conversation to have.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one thing I've been thinking about through this entire panel is it's sort of a chicken and an egg problem about which should come first. Either whether we should be more focused on trying to change people's minds and ideas with regard to bodily autonomy and human dignity, or whether we should just keep focusing on preventing any sort of legislative actions from coming into effect, and sort of wait for the natural progression of society to lead to the changed ideas about bodily autonomy. And I just want to get.
Yeah, so before we get to answering, I want to repeat that for the recording. This is talking about whether we should focus, which comes first, focusing on changing hearts and minds, or focusing on changing legislation and working on proactive legislation or changing harmful legislation.
Both. It's a concurrent issue. You got to take care of both, because in the process of changing legislation, you're going to meet a lot of opposition. You're going to have to know how to present arguments in a way that people can understand. That's going to make the changing of the legislation easier for you. We do have to continue to fight because these issues are a problem. I mean, these are big issues. But the natural progression that you're discussing, that society has, this natural progression towards, I guess, more moral, more as what we would call moral, not restricting someone's rights, but what we would call moral is based on that grassroots effort that we're talking about, the changing of people's minds. That can't take place if we don't change minds, if we're always fighting them. See, what you want to do is you kind of want to remove the threat. If you remove the threat, the legislation doesn't really become as much of an issue down the road because the minds are changing. Now they've joined forces with you. So at this point, yeah, keep fighting for the legislation, keep fighting for that because it's an issue we need to change. But on the other hand, there should also be this epistemological effort to go out and ask people why they have these beliefs, where they're rooted in, and to pick them apart and destroy them. And I'm saying destroy them here in this room. I wouldn't say that necessarily anywhere else, but they're destroying the rights of everybody else. They're destroying people's lives. And this woman can't do things that are beneficial for her health. She can't either. His wife is dealing with this. This is a stress on him as well, watching her go through this. It's expensive. You've got these things going on, and they're not thinking about the trickle-down effect. And we have that should be the driving force behind changing people's minds. So you got to do both.
Yeah, I think it's important that obviously you have maybe different approaches to each side, but I kind of think they're one and the same because when it comes right down to it, people vote with their hearts and minds, right? So, we want to get what victories we can while we're in the process of doing all of that. So, fighting in the courts and fighting in the legislatures and that kind of stuff, that's all important. But at the end of the day, that's the reason why with queer and trans activism, I don't necessarily show up at city council meetings and all that, whatever. I want to change people's minds so they change their vote, right? So you convince people to elect people for whom reproductive justice is a priority. And so that, you know, it starts there because people vote based on their hearts and minds, if that makes sense.
And please, we're almost wrapping up, so go ahead. But
I'll
yeah.
be really quick. Again, you mentioned the idea of natural progression toward kind of a more just state. I don't think that there is such a thing as natural progression. I don't think there is a single victory for personal liberties that hasn't been hard won with blood, sweat, and tears. So
Yeah, and I'm going to close quickly with a theme that I know the SSA has been trying to figure out how to articulate, which is that the idea that the moral arc bends towards justice, but sometimes you have to be the people bending it and pushing it and working every day to change it. So when you change hearts and minds, and you eventually change the legislation, so I think it does really have to be a dual approach. So thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to our panel.